what that taught me is just how to think about people, how to talk to people, how to get your point across to people. And so one of the things that I think I've had an advantage of in my career is, security is a subject where it's very hard to convince people to do things that they don't actually understand or they don't see the value of, right? Because security is about convincing people to do something that if there's no threat and there's no impact, then that's a good thing. Well, how do you measure that? And so the absence of something is not great from a statistics perspective. And so what you're really seeing is truly this security and resiliency that is being built in by design, by policy, into the technologies that we are building and then deploying. Now, the question becomes, are you able to continually manage and maintain, those technologies as you built them? We're less good at that, right? So that goes back to the question of precision and quality.
Welcome to Tools for Tech Leaders, a podcast for C-suite executives and tech decision makers. I'm your host, Ian Tien, CEO and co-founder of Mattermost, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Kris Lovejoy, Global Practice Leader for Security and Resilience at Kyndryl and a renowned expert in cybersecurity. With rapidly evolving cyber threats, changing regulatory landscapes, and the emergence of AI technologies, organizations face an unprecedented challenge in maintaining security and resilience. Kris brings an extensive degree of experience in leadership roles at Kyndryl, E&Y, Blue Vector, and IBM to help us navigate those complex issues. She's got an unconventional journey becoming from the English major background to becoming a cybersecurity leader, and she's got some really unique perspectives. I'm so excited to have Kris on the show today. Kris, welcome.
Thank you, Ian. Good to be here.
Yeah, I think we see a lot. We see each other at conferences, and there's a lot going on in the world. And one of the topics we talked about before is resilience in operational technology, industrial control systems. And I think that the world has gotten more complicated as international relations and foreign policy change. And I think it was not something that was in our predictions for 2025. How are you seeing some of the changes impact these sort of industries as people think about planning and supply chain and all those things around resilience?
Yeah, well, this is great questions. We are in a period of unparalleled volatility. I think we would definitely agree. So just if we rewind the clock about a year or two ago, the concept of resilience and critical infrastructure was becoming almost like buzzword conversation. We're talking about it a whole lot. And good reason. I mean, I think what we all recognized is that, as we've become more digitally enabled, we've become more digitally dependent. A lot of our critical infrastructure industries are, delivering their, critical services in critical infrastructure to, people every day. And here is a recognition that with the broadening attack landscape, the fact that a lot of that, technology equipment, particularly the ICS OCS environment, is unpatched, pretty old, that, the regulatory authorities got involved and began to introduce legislation like NIS2 in, the European Union, which really dictate that organizations need to get better at managing resilience. I think fast track a year, and I think people care about resilience, but it's less because there is a regulatory dictate, though, of course, in some, sectors, it's still an issue. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why people are worried about resilience, particularly around, the supply chain and in any place. Yeah, big issues.
Yeah, 100% with you. I mean, we're seeing that with, I remember there's this large bank I was talking to, and they were complaining because they were asking for a resilience plan if you had to if you kind of get off of public cloud. Like, what is our plan if we had to reverse course from public cloud? And people this will never happen. It's impossible. And yet it's starting to a little bit. And these kind of crazy outlier scenarios, like the tinfoil hat people, just feel like they're coming true.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And on the data center side, I've been actually. I'm glad you brought that up because I'm watching this, fascinated by this pattern of moving out of the cloud back in on-prem, because what's really interesting is, most like financial institutions, I don't know if you've seen the same thing, but a lot of them, they've got a hybrid environment, right? Like they've got a lot of their critical infrastructure, core banking systems, et cetera, they really haven't gone 100% to the public cloud. A lot of it is still on-prem. And so they've been flirting with the idea of going to public cloud, but a lot of them are now saying, you know what, between the data, kind of the crunching requirements that I need, and the question I have about, data integrity, confidentiality, privacy, perhaps it's better if I just maintain that on-prem because it'll be more cost effective. And so it's slowing kind of a migration to the cloud. And I also am seeing in financials and others, they're also saying, you know what, maybe because of the issue that you're just describing, cloud is not the place for me. So let's start designing kind of the comeback plan. And one of the things we do in my practice is we actually do the data center design. That's one of our functions. We have never seen as many requests for data center design as we have this year. So just underscoring that point.
Yeah, I think there's sort of like two vectors that we've seen. One is like, well, the question is like, what does cloud mean? Because it's kind of this marketing term. There's one which is orchestration, virtualization, whether it's on premise or a third party vendor. People want to move there. Kubernetes based, auto heal, auto scale. There's another one which is basically like there's global hyperscalers and then there's sovereign hyperscaler. Right. So it's like that distinction has been blurred a little bit. And now it's getting like super clear. It's like, where exactly is our data located? And all these things are just kind of coming back. So, one thing that one of our customers or one of our people that we know is talking about is that like, well, actually all software is on-prem. Cloud is a social construct to make you comfortable to host your data in someone else's on-prem system.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. I hadn't thought about it before, but yeah, that definitely makes sense. Yeah, it's like a rental. Yeah, there is a dearth of technology options in Europe, so it's interesting because I think they have to be very mindful of the situation. What I am hearing though, when I go to Europe, is a lot of discussion that is twofold and very interesting. One is in and about kind of this recognition that there is no sovereign technology industry upon which Europe can really depend. And so there's a need for the European nations to really invest and build its own domain, technology industry to compete with the US and, China and others. So that makes sense. But they're also suggesting that regulation is actually hampering progress. I haven't heard this quite as much as I've been hearing now. And so what I'm hearing is in order to compete effectively and to build this technology industry, there has to be a loosening of the restrictions from a regulatory perspective. I hadn't expected that, but I do think that all of the tariff concerns, the recognition of the lack of the industry, the technology industry, is actually pushing deregulation on the technology sphere, which is interesting for us because in security, a lot of the reason why, people will actually invest in security is because there's a regulation. So I'm of two minds on this particular subject. So I don't know about you, but yeah, it's both, I'm definitely conflicted.
Yeah, I think well, it's so there's this Berlin Global Dialogue last year, right, where they had France and Germany and all these. There's like the Shangri-La Dialogue in Asia. There's like this Berlin global dialogue that's happening, and it was really interesting. The conversations there, exactly to your point, which was in order for Europe to be more sovereign, they have to have the right level of regulation, right? And the specific quote was they needed time to digest the regulations they have right now, and to sort of build up the infrastructure. So exactly right. You can start a company in Europe, but if you're going to raise the Series A, you go to the U.S. and Silicon Valley because that's where the capital markets are. If you're going to go public, you also go to the U.S. markets because the European ones and the global ones are fragmented by country. And if Europe is able to pool its resources, create a capital market where you can scale in Europe, because what's actually happening is, as you try to go public, we can't meet the liquidity requirements of a lot of large funds in the European market. So you have to go to the U.S. As well as to pick up capital. There's cultural changes, but I think that there's this and this was even happening sort of last year. This importance on sovereignty, and to be able to create these sort of to have the supply chain capability, right, and to be sort of fully sovereign, within the European Union. So 100% see what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's going to be, I don't think anybody recognizes the level of interdependency between various, very small supply chain partners that exist all over the world. I think it would be mind-boggling if anybody really understood what was under the covers, within their data centers.
Yeah. There's the data center supply chain. There's all the small vendors, and then manufacturing. You also have like this critical supply chain that you and I've talked about in other discussions. And it's like we were talking about, well, how do you secure these small businesses? How do you stop their disruption? Ransomware attacks, 25% target these manufacturers. And now it just feels like we were so focused on those pieces. Like, what category are we in? Is operational resilience that used to be about supply, that used to be around cyber? How would you think about, if maybe a boardroom level, how would you think about framing this as a topic to address in terms of resiliency? Like, what are the categories? How do you analyze that problem today?
In some senses, those manufacturers or those that are in the manufacturing industry are heavily reliant on manufacturers to produce the goods upon which they will assemble and then deliver their goods. In some senses, they're, because of their cost sensitivity to the supply chain, over time, they've kind of grown the mechanisms by which they can actually monitor it. And so I think what they're doing now is they're applying a different lens. But what I'm seeing is that those companies where it's kind of like a secondary kind of piece of their business, they're not necessarily ready. And so like the financial services companies that you're talking about, right? They think about it, but they're not like really majoring and thinking about when you're procuring the technology, like, where did it come from? Who built it? Was it built by the U.S.? Was it built by, it's kind of binary. It's like it was built by the West or it was built by the East. They're not really thinking about specifically where was that built, and can I trust that this is going to be available? Can I trust that I can afford this on a long-term basis? They just don't have that kind of, within the systems that they maintain, they just don't have that level of detail. So I think a lot of companies, right now, honestly, they're just struggling with just even understanding what the bill of materials is in their, digitally enabled services, let alone like what the provenance of the technology components are. So when I sit with customers and, they'll ask you, like, where do you start? You got to start with the basics, right? It's not, it's just, do you know how your services work? Do you know the technology components? Do you understand within those technology components, like who's building them? Who's maintaining them? What if they went away? Could you replace them? But you gotta start somewhere. And sometimes that somewhere is starting with just the basics, like I said, which again, people don't necessarily understand today.
Yeah, 100%. And then do you think about that so there's the supply chain piece, but there's also sort of like your digital supply chain. So you've got sort of like these two pieces. So as a manufacturer, what is the lineage, and what is the lineage of all these different places? And I've talked to a bunch of manufacturers, and they're like, well, we could move to like Vietnam, or we could move here, but like 80% of the components. And I was talking to a tablet manufacturer that makes like hardened components, and 80% of it still comes from PRC. It doesn't matter where you actually assemble it. And yeah, I think that sort of like when you get to the source, like there's for a lot of the components, yeah, you're gonna find out, but then you're gonna have to deal with like the reality of like where they're actually coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
When you think about that digitally and all the digital services, right, the SaaS services and pieces, like how do you think about, as you mentioned before, sometimes you want it local, right? You want it local for bandwidth, you want it for local for regulatory compliance, you want it local for data, you want it local for, even now, like a lot of the sovereign AI, like people want that it to be sort of a nationalistic, under like in terms of bias and trust and safety, be able to have that under, sort of domestic regulation. So when you think about that onshoring of digital, which, do you think that's feasible? Do you think that there's going to be, do you think over time that this is going to be a permanent dent in the history of technology? Do you see more sovereign infrastructure being spun up in Europe and these other places? Or do you feel like this is blip, it will pass, and we'll just kind of go back to like 2024?
I think you and we've probably seen a lot of this movie before, or at least, pieces of the movie enough that we can kind of guess what's going to come next. And I guess there's a lot of anger right now, and I think a lot of organizations are going to be, over the short term at least. What I would foresee is we're going to see a slowdown in tech spend, because I think a lot of organizations are worried exactly about these issues. They're worried about the supply chain resilience. They're feeling like they don't necessarily have a good handle on what they've already got. So they're going to begin to engage in a what-if planning scenario. And so a lot of organizations that we're working with are just thinking about, okay, so what does a resilient infrastructure look like? What are the different choices? And as they're going through that process, they're saying, geez, you know what? Like a wholesale change is going to be really expensive. Oh, by the way, the technology that I really want to buy is not available to me in my sovereign state. If I were to wait around for it to magically appear, it's going to be years. And by that point in time, there's going to be a lot of, competitive disruption around me. So I can't really afford to wait. So I think what's going to end up happening is organizations are going to slow down where they can kind of tweak their strategy. They will. I think a lot more are going to be reticent to do wholesale moves to cloud just because of these sovereign issues. I think they're going to be, building, at least from a disaster recovery perspective, we see a lot of them, focusing on on-prem, operations. I think the data piece becomes tricky. I think because, you can keep the technology operating in your data center. You can control it in your four walls. You can build it yourself. That's the easy part. The harder part is sourcing data and feeding your corpus of data in such a way that you get enough data to actually make good sense, right? Because a lot of the use cases for AI are based on the availability of lots and lots and lots and lots of data that likely did not come from onshore. And in order to get, good training data, you have to source that data elsewhere. And that comes from people. It doesn't necessarily come from technology operating, within your bounds. And so I think what's going to end up happening is, like I said, slowdown in spending, a lot more kind of moving onshore technology, not necessarily hard, changing out all of your equipment, but like fiddling around the edges, and then a realization that there has to be data neutrality, if you will. And so I think you're going to see less restriction on data flow, non-personally identifiable data flow, just so that the use cases can be met. Hope that makes sense.
Wow, that makes sense. I didn't even think about that, like the AI and then the data requirements. So it's like the more data you have, the more effective your AI is. And if you stop the data flows across boundaries and you sort of like you ring fence it, then you actually can sort of tip the scales of who actually has the most usable AI. I didn't even think about that. That's
Yeah. Like, to think of simple use cases, biological research or medical research. Think about it, a world where the only data that you have for medical research is available in, a very small locality. The number of biases that can be built into that model are incredible. In order to do good biological medical research, you need to have access to a corpus of data that's representative of the group that you want to serve. And that by definition means that you're going to have to source data from lots and lots and lots of different places. So the restriction of data is counterintuitive, to those particular, use cases. And so I do think that, getting access, like I said, data access is going to be key because data is that liquid upon which AI is going to be powered.
It's really fascinating. So the AI and data restrictions are one set, and proprietary technology is another. So just kind of curious about the opposite, which is open source AI models, open source data sets, and then open source infrastructure. So there was a time when open source, especially for the countries, I mean, a lot of in France and Europe, they use a lot of open source because it's the closest thing to sovereign they have. Even if it's not manufactured, having open source is really, I think, an important capability internationally. Strikingly, on the U.S. sort of defense side, they're a little bit more skeptical of open source in certain areas because it can be vulnerable to supply chain attacks, and there are adversaries that target deep high upstream supply chain attacks into these open source systems. So going the opposite of proprietary and closed, how do you think open source might evolve in this world? Like, how would you think about the data, AI infrastructure in that open source world?
I absolutely believe that open source is going to be, where the majority of the development efforts are focused. And I think there's no possibility that, we would see a world where more than, a small number of technologies was really, sort of a closed and encapsulated system. Because I think exactly kind of the points that you're indicating, there is a ubiquity associated with open source that makes it possible for any nation state to compete. And so I think whether they realize it or not, open source is it's democracy in technology. And I think there's the question of what is open source. There's the question of how do you test that open source? How do you maintain that open source? We as, our philosophy in our organization, everything we build is open source. And the reason we do it that way is, exactly because of, kind of some of the things that you're talking about. We had to, I'll give you an example, our security operations capability. So when we built the security operations, we built it with this concept of techno-nationalism, was going to be, okay, maybe I saw a little bit of this bingo card, but I have one or two of the bingo pieces. But what we foresaw is that most organizations were going to want to process security data locally. And they're going to want to do it because of either regulatory reasons or alternatively because of the cost of processing in a cloud, or because it was too expensive to transport, whatever the case may be. So we created these concepts of essentially pods, where there were open source pods that could be deployed in a nation state. Data could be analyzed and abstracted, and then there was complete observability across the scenes, but you could have local data processing. I think a lot of organizations are thinking about data analytics as being deployed in that way, where you have pods of technologies that are open source, can be deployed locally, then the data can be abstracted and then can be used in tokenized and then used. I think that's kind of the future. And so I would imagine that we're going to be going to a world that looks more like that than what it looks like today.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Can you say more about the pods? What are the capabilities inside those pods? I'm super curious.
So it's like a data plane and a control plane, but think about the data plane and the data analytics as being local, and then the control plane as being open source, and then enabling organizations to kind of manage across. So, Kubernetes, clusters, and then, being able to use other forms of, think of it as, so we'll use OpenShift, Ansible to actually do kind of the management of the assets pursuant to the data that is being analyzed, and then providing us the kind of understanding of what's happening within the the organization so that we can actually, like, we'll do a lot of outsourcing. We do things like simple use case risk-based patch management. So we do the local data processing. We see that, there's a particular threat. We see that what the system configuration is, all of that sort of the data analytics happens locally, but then we use run books that may be sourced and then applied using like an Ansible script. But we use Ansible to actually do the patching, the actual patching of the systems. Again, the patching, comes from the control plane that could have been sourced anywhere. The data that was used for the analytics is local and locally processed.
Yeah, totally. That's awesome. Yeah, I didn't even. So that's all open source and local and sovereign.
Yeah.
What do you think about the sort of the next generation of sort of those type of platforms with AI enablement? I'm kind of curious how you think about bringing like this sort of non-deterministic thing that's going to come in and help do with the analysis, but you can't really guarantee what the output is, and you can't really test it quite as much. I was talking to one person in the U.S. government about like, well, how are you securing these models as CIO? And he's basically, he said, we actually treat them like a person. And we actually do background checks. Like, where did you come from? Where did you do your training? Who do you talk to? So it was almost like a human being. And I thought that was just sort of fascinating.
I will go one further on that. In addition, what we're seeing is that some corporations are coming to us, and in the contracts and the T's and C's, they are explicitly suggesting that the AI algorithms have the same liability that a human would have.
Oh, wow.
Yep. Now, we're like, no. we don't even know how to think about that, but we are seeing it in contract language.
Yeah, it's a total aside. When I was in graduate school, like over a decade ago, there's a guy named Ryan Callow at the law school, and he was doing like robot law. And I'm like, what is robot law? But, everything from self-driving cars to insurance, all these things, like there's going to be like robot law.
Makes sense. Absolutely makes sense.
So when you think about, so there's robot law, there's going to be some expectation, maybe it's not full liability, but it's a software system. Are there, like, what are you seeing evolving as like the sort of standardized test for some of these AIs? Like, so you're going to spend all your time, vetting like one, and then it's going to be out of date in like 2 seconds. Cause like the next one comes out, it's 90%, more efficient, and it's got but yeah, it's the new shiny one. What we're seeing with our community is people want to swap in the models, but in order to swap in the models, they have to do sort of trust and safety all over again. And you kind of need a way to sort of automate this. So, one thought is like, there's just going to be, from the hyperscalers, there's going to be trust and safety models. You're going to pick one that's sort of pre-vetted, or you're going to think about sort of nationalistic. I love that kind of term, that sort of techno-nationalism. It's sort of like, okay, for our world, I'm just kind of like, where do you think that pendulum's going to swing? Is it going to be both? Are they going to just have like off the shelf, like trusted models? Is there going to be like a grading system?
I think it depends on what you can afford, honestly. So I would imagine that, it's going to be like, you could buy from Walmart or you can buy from Bloomingdale's, but there are going to be, basically department stores of AI algorithms that are pre-vetted that you can acquire. But if you have the ability to, to build your own bespoke suit, if you will, that's going to happen. But I think it's going to be more of a question of economics than anything else. And so that's what I fully expect. I think the question for me is, I think that technically we can figure out how to test the algorithms. What I don't think we know how to do is test the integrity of the data that we're using to feed the algorithms. That's the part that really worries me, because we still don't, it's all largely a judgment call as to whether or not the data corpus is going to end up in, providing unreliable results. I don't know how we do that. I honestly don't. And I don't know whether you've seen anything that helps, but I've just not seen, I've seen anything that really gets us to a place where we can trust the data.
Yeah, so that is, we work with a lot of governments, and these people are pretty advanced. And there's interesting, there's different approaches. There's this concept of, I was in Asia recently, and there's the concept of a butler AI, and the butler AI will go to different models, maybe need summarization or need math, and the butler will figure it out. The thing that I find internationally that's super, so you can swap in and out. You'll have different trust levels, right? And they might be, approved for certain functions. But the one that was sort of fascinating, to your point of the data, is translation models. So this can happen with there's people who speak English with different accents, and then it's like you got to get it sort of just right. There's also translation modules that have, I didn't realize this, but there's a lot of culture in language. So I was with one government, and it would translate to their language from English. But if you asked it to, for example, organize a dinner party, it would organize it using the American protocol. And because they just basically lost all trust because the culture was so different, even though the language was accurate. So you've got accents, you've got sort of behaviors, sort of values, all baked into language. I thought it was just a translation module. So they actually say you've got a summarization module or a math module. You can leave that. That's going to be probably good enough. But the language they actually have to update monthly, because what is in the zeitgeist of what word means what is constantly changing. So that's what that's what we're kind of seeing. I don't know if you've got parallels in.
No, I mean, I just go back to, my days in Blue Vector, where, this is one of my first forays, into this field. And I think, the lesson I learned there stuck with me, is because what we were doing is, we had taken all known malware, and we had used that malware to train supervised machine learning models to recognize good software versus bad software. So the concept was, we had all golden images of every software ever made, all malware, put those two together. You could create a predictive model to say, okay, this looks like zero-day malware because we've got all the malware. Well, guess what? Good software often looks like malware, and malware often looks like really well-coded software. And so, I realized, okay, well, there is kind of the eye of the beholder kind of concept, and so then there's so we've got to begin to slim down the models so that you're asking very specific questions so that you can be assured of the integrity of the data that you're providing to the model, so that it can be trained to actually recognize kind of the true variations. But I look at a lot of the use cases where we're using, AI today. I mean, a lot of it is in making judgment calls. And the question is, how do you actually, when it comes to self-driving, and you're one of those catch-22 scenarios of, you run over the cat or you get in an accident, what is the judgment call that you make? Who trains? Who makes that decision? How is that decision made? It's just, I think we don't necessarily understand what we're doing yet. And so again, I think my sense is a lot of organizations they're conscious of what they don't know. And so they're being careful about it. I think where things become a little tricky is when they go to those department store models, and then they go to the department store models of data for data. And they're just trusting that the repositories of data that they're sourcing or they're acquiring, they're trusting that data is acceptable. And that's where I become nervous, is where that they have no consideration for how bad that data can be. And that can lead to some really bad consequences.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, prompt injection attacks is something that we think about a lot of time on our side, and our customers do. And it's funny because there's sort of a dial you turn on how much control your AI has. And for me, I'm kind of even in a test environment, why don't we just run this internally with the dial to just go fast? And my security teams points out a number of things. It's prompt injection, all these different So all these different sort of threats that I'm oh, okay, I get it. You even in very closed environments that are sort of in theory very safe, you've got this sort of unknown data model with you don't know what's in the box, right? It's I don't want to say it's the apple with the razor blade at Halloween, But it's like you kind of worry because like all you need is sort of one. It's almost like you've got a sleeper inside your AI, inside your company, right? That can do certain things. And what's also scary is that a lot of this executes in the user's context, right? So like that's even, but to make it useful, you need it to execute in the user context.
Yeah.
So what are you seeing? Are you seeing, so the latest I've got is we've got like 3 different environments, right? One that's just like Wild West, doesn't have any proprietary data, doesn't have like any real data, and you just like go and you play. And then we've got our official one, which is like locked down because it's got, different types of data. And then we've got a middle one, which is a mix, no confidential data in there. It's open with our open source community, and it's sort of like a playground. So, are there sort of standard practices and models as you roll out this AI, like in terms of, are there like dials that you see for like move fast versus be careful?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, and I tend to work with larger organizations. So the programs that they put in place tend to be a little bit more robust, if you will, from a governance perspective. And so what I'm seeing is that, most organizations today, they'll have like a standing AI ethics board. And, the way it's working is you have to come in with a business case, essentially, which describes, what is it that you want to accomplish? What's the data, the provenance of the data that you're going to be using? What's the model? What are the outcomes that you expect? How are you going to measure it? And then the ethics board does the review and the evaluation. And if there's additional security controls that need to be introduced in order to make that possible, then those requirements go out. But it's a way of funneling the use cases through a body that is representative of the security team, the development team, the HR team, et cetera, et cetera. So, and legal team, compliance organization, business controls. But lots of different stakeholders are kind of learning in real time, and they're kind of developing and designing the control mechanisms for managing these use cases as the use cases appear. It's not like a lot of these things have been built, so it's a more of an agile methodology. And so I'd say, in some robust governance, less robust control infrastructure, and the determination as to where that dial setting happens is determined in real time as the ethics board is evaluating those use cases.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's certainly the robust and sort of responsible way to do it. I think so 100%, right? Like that's most of these large enterprises, responsible organizations, it's some flavor of that. One thing that we've noticed, because we work with a lot of defense, I'll say this is what I've kind of noticed is that when there's something that's adversarial in some way, where it's a little bit of a race, we've noticed this change in mindset. So the saying was like the defense industry used to be very slow moving and optimizing for not making a mistake. And what's actually changed is they want to find ways to move faster and then balance risk with outcomes. And we see this, and you're seeing this internationally a little bit more because internationally was a little slower moving. I mean, there's sort of innovators and disruptors all over the industry, so it's not homogenous. But you see now in the leadership this notion of sort of innovation, and that needs to balance on the risk taking side. One of the things that's very public is like Space Force is actually one of the really very innovative organizations out there that's kind of like groundbreaking in many thoughtful ways. And the other piece that I've kind of noticed is there's smaller financial institutions that have like market competitors, like hedge fundy kind of organizations that are just kind of like go, right? Because they're smaller and they're more nimble and they can kind of do this. And I'm just kind of curious, like, do you see, so there's the current way to do things that is responsible, it is scale, and is enterprise, and is responsible. Do you see it as a pure sort of like, they talk about like, cost, speed, and quality, like that triangle. Do you see it as a balance, or do you find ways that you can actually move quickly with precision and high quality? Did you see that, there's a way to kind of get there?
So it's quality and precision are often not necessarily good friends. So I'm not sure if we've reached that point yet. I- this is excellent questions. Um, okay, I'm going to answer your question a little bit of a different way. I do see that the kind of the revolutions are kind of the cycles, they're coming closer together. It's almost, it's like when we used to say, continuous innovation. I don't know we understood continuous innovation in today's world. I mean, this is like it's not it's continuous innovation. It is like continuous revolution of innovation on a second by second basis. I mean, the amount of stuff that's happening today, it's extraordinary. Now, what is good about that, though? I'm pleased to see, and where I think the market is growing and enabling this cycle of innovation to actually exist in a way which is not necessarily absolutely precise, nor has absolute quality yet, but is getting better, is in that, and we talk about it like with operational resilience, and I'm going to come back to that first question, like just the role of what security is and the role of how IT and security work together, and kind of how how the development organization is now. We used to talk about this years ago, the development, built by design, so build security by design. The fact is, when you think about like open source and you think about building cloud native applications or any kind of application or technology that can kind of exist in today's world, what's happening is, organizations are essentially, think about it, they're creating these landing zones, and then they're defining as part of, sort of the landing zone, what are the security controls that need to be implemented and integrated in any technology that is being built, within the context. And so what you're really seeing is truly this, security and resiliency that is being built in by design, by policy into the technologies that we are building and then deploying. Now, the question becomes, are you able to continually manage and maintain, those technologies as you built them? We're less good at that, right? So that goes back to the question of precision and quality. We're good. I think where we've gotten, it's like almost like this, it's like a trough where we have forced ourselves to be really good up front. And when you build it and you build it the right way, we can build it. But we don't build it in a way that it can continue to evolve on its own. I still think that so we get to a point where we build it, we put it into production, and then we don't know necessarily how to maintain it. To your point, we're ripping it out and we're replacing it. Now, maybe that's the model. Maybe the new model is less of an evolving model and it's more of a software build, tear down, and replace model. I don't know what that all means to us, but I think that and the reason I'm pointing this out is because when it comes to like the maintenance model, that's a very different model, right? Like our entire industry is tuned to kind of like the ITIL model, right? That you build something and then you define the policy, then you monitor the policy. And then when something varies from the policy, you correct it, you remediate it. But now we're in a world where you build the policy, you build the thing, you tear it down, you have to build a new policy, you have to build a new thing. We're in a world where we're building things, we're letting them sit, we're not tearing them down, then we're introducing something else new. So we're in a hoarding model. And so it's an interesting dilemma, I think, in that, we haven't quite come to grips with, we need to tear down, throw away, destroy, and replace. We're trying to still evolve. And I fundamentally wonder whether the model we have in place actually works. So that's kind of like what's going in my head as like me and my team, as we think about like, what do we want to build? What are we building? I'm sort of thinking like the old world, like we got to totally, completely shift our thinking to a different way. Because going like all of the points that you've made about open source, about resilience, about AI, about like we have to, in order for all of these things to be true, the old paradigms of technology no longer exist for us. We got to throw it away and we got to think about something completely different.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love that IT hoarding. I definitely see that with the IT leaders that I talk to. And it's like, you can walk in and it's like, we have everything. Like, you name it, we bought it. And it's like impossible to secure because there's too many of them. And it's almost like harder to deactivate a system than to like buy a new product.
Oh, and well, a lot of the paper, I mean, I've worked, and I know you work with CISOs, but I'm sure you've heard this as well. It's like, and this is what they don't tell you in the office, but after dinner, it's like, hey, I just asked for X, amount of money from my boss to put this thing in. I'm not going to go back to them and say, oh yeah, it's old now. I bought it a year ago. It's no longer, useful. I got to like change it out. I mean, so, I think a lot of organizations today, they're either building an ecosystem in which their organization can develop and continually develop, or they're buying a relationship with a partner who's going to continue to evolve for them, or they're thinking of a hybrid model where they're kind of assembling and disassembling parts on their own. Like as things come in, they're able to source them from different categories. But they're more, most organizations they're not thinking about, like, it's interesting, and forgive me, I know I'm running on this, but, when you go into like a financial institution, most of them have these like monolithic underlying infrastructures, and then they have applications they built on top of the infrastructure. And so what we hear a lot is, I've got my application, and then my application owner wants to make decisions, but they don't realize by taking a risk here at the application layer, because of the way the application is integrated into the infrastructure, if they take the risk, then all of the other business owners are going to have the same risk. And that can't happen. And so they're like, okay, well, we got to create guardrails, and then this application owner has to know that we've got this monolithic infrastructure so they can only make such technology sources. And then the application owners are saying, yeah, but you're too slow and we need to be more agile. And so we're going to build, we're going to build our own application infrastructure stack. So we hear this, oh yeah, this is going to be the platformization of the application. So the application is going to be combined with the infrastructure. I think both. It's just, that's not actually how it's going to end up. I think kind of like where we're going with this, which is you got a harness, and then you've got components that are going to be put in, pulled in, pulled out, pulled in. They're like microcode that is going to be pulled and pulled out to create an experience. That's going to be more the model of where we end up going than where we are today. It is a very different way of thinking. Like when I'm thinking about like what it is we need to do, I'm thinking more along those lines than I'm thinking about the application platformization or the monolithic with the application verticals. Because I think over time, as you begin to see, all of these small open source components being integrated, reused, thrown away, no one can afford to like pay a lot of money for any one of those given things, those units. It's more of a, how do I sustainably ensure that I've got a constant pipeline of innovation coming into the tank and into my infrastructure so that I can continue to maintain that high level of experience that I promised and the outcomes that I promised to the end users and to those that have agreed to actually pay for the creation of this thing in the first place.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's very classic. I think the monolithic application versus microservices in the different flavors is a question that it's like when you swing to one and swing to the other, grass is always greener, right? So you're like, okay, I'm in the microservices. Oh wait, everything is like incredibly like correlated. So if like one thing goes down, like everything falls over. Yeah. So like, and we don't understand the architecture. Like we can't, it's just a giant blob. Okay, that's microservices. Let's go monolith. But it's like, oh, monolith is like really expensive and can't change and it's not flexible. So yeah, I think that's the riddle of, I think, software architecture.
Oh yeah. Which is, like we said, changing every second.
Yeah, I think there was a quote that was it was a couple of years ago, but I think like we live in a post-digital world, and this concept of strategic planning, these 5-year plans, is like, we've always said the 5-year plan is not going to be that useful. It's the thinking that is helpful, but it's almost like every 6 months you have to change the 5-year plan, right? If you just kind of like rewind like year after year, it's been this kind of nonstop like the plan's got to change, right? Whether it's AI or it's tariffs or it's like everything that's ZERP, it just feels like every 6 months there's something new.
But it's gotten to almost like noise now, which is we are. Volatility, I don't, and I think this is just true. We're going to be living in a high state of agitation for pretty much forever. So, like, the question is, how does that, how does the digital environment, how does it need to morph to enable this just absolute chaos? And I think we've got a digital world that was built on concepts of globalization. And if it is true that this pendulum is going to swing and it's going to get stuck, like we've been saying, how the heck do we change our globalized digital model to something that is capable of rapidly evolving, recognizing that we have to source technology from places we don't want to? We've got to source data from, providers we don't necessarily trust. How do we do that in a cost-effective way, and do it in a way that's going to, allow us to maintain our competitiveness? This is not easy. And it's good to have people like you who are actually thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, so Kris, you've got this background as an English major, and it's really fascinating because a lot of folks in cyber come from different, IT backgrounds and things. And I was super curious, like, how does sort of coming from an English major background inform how you think today, how you lead, how you analyze problems?
Yeah, so when I was at school, I did study English literature, and I studied primarily existentialism, philosophy, that sort of thing, which is really about, kind of the dark heart of people, if you will. And at the same time, I also studied international affairs. And I was focused at that time, Warsaw Pact was still a thing. And so we were focusing on, how to convince, Warsaw Pact nations to actually adhere to democratic ideals, and how would you kind of go about nation building, that sort of thing. And so what that taught me is just how to think about people, how to talk to people, how to get your point across to people. And so one of the things that I think I've had an advantage of in my career is, security is a subject where it's very hard to convince people to do things that they don't actually understand or they don't see the value of, right? Because security is about convincing people to do something that they just, if there's no threat and there's no impact, then that's a good thing. Well, how do you measure that? And so the absence of something is not great from a statistics perspective. So anyway, I've been able to kind of communicate in verbal and in, presentation format, like the why things are important. And that stood me pretty well. And I studied a lot about finance, and that was not kind of something that was natural to me. I would say for anybody who is thinking about, taking on more of a management role, it is really important to understand a balance sheet, because at the end of the day, a lot of security is about money. And so you've really got to understand both how to get the money to fund what you want to do, as well as like how to talk about impacts within that context as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I love that concept of like, cybersecurity is about convincing people to do things in their best interest.
Yeah. Yeah. And everybody knows it's hard. So when you ask like, why can't you? Because they don't understand why you're asking them to do what you're asking them to do. So.
Yeah, very much with you. And it's crazy how much impact these small controls like MFA can just like change everything.
Yeah, like patching something where, we were talking earlier about there are certain nation states who they don't like to change technology. They like old stuff because they think change is a risk. And so trying to convince somebody it's, change is actually a good thing, it's hard to do.
And you can't convince them they can't convince them because they can't even detect the breach.
Yeah, right. Oh, I've heard that too. Well, if we don't log, then does that mean we won't be liable if there's a breach? No.
Kris, thank you so much. It's been absolutely an amazing conversation. I really loved having you on the show. Is there anywhere on social media that people can meet you, can find out more about your work?
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn. And so you can find me at Kris Lovejoy at Kyndryl, Kyndryl is the company name. And please reach out and look forward to connecting.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kris.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you like this content, please join our LinkedIn group. Please thumbs up, please comment, please subscribe. And we'd love to bring more of this content to you.